Welcome, David Harrelson from the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde.
It's wonderful to be a guest of all of yours today in this beautiful space where I had the chance of being a board member for 4 years and to see it come to life in this way. And I think that as you'll find in this conversation and what I'm going to share, we have probably a lot of common interests. And I'm hoping that I can share information that I know about my family's connection to this place, but really thinking of it as place is a vessel. And all of you have a connection to this place, whether you're just visiting here, right? You're from a different area, or whether you are actively creating your livelihood and economy only a few miles away from this place. And if you're not from here and you're from somewhere else, know that the types of information that I'm talking about are also going to be available where you're from, right? Where you're calling home. And that there's somebody out there who is the keeper of that knowledge or that information. So my talk today is Managing for Abundance, Indigenous Knowledge and Practices for Keeping Place. For me, in a traditional sense, I'm a Kalapuya person. Those are the indigenous people of the Willamette Valley. My ancestors have been here since time immemorial, literally since a time that no one can remember. And when we introduce ourselves within our community and among other tribal people, we talk about who our family is because it helps share the context of how we're coming into a space. And so with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my family, which maybe seems very different than the scientific presentation that we received earlier, but I think it'll help you understand where I'm coming from. I'll start with my grandma. My grandma Ellen worked her whole life at Chehalem Indian School. That's a boarding Indian school that was established in the 1800s. It was established for a purpose that was really different than what she spent her whole life working there as. By the time she came to work there, that was a place to provide empowerment to Native kids that maybe didn't have access to educational opportunities on their really remote reservations all across the American West. Her particular love for the kids that live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon that would get helicoptered out and brought to school so that they actually had a school to go to. And she had all these jobs from working in the dormitories to being a teacher's aide and eventually on the board of that before she passed away. So I've been exposed to that in a lot of Indian country as a result of it. Chehalem Indian School is located in Salem, Oregon, and it's still in existence. And it just serves a different purpose than when it was established, which was to assimilate Indian people, right? Their motto of the time was, kill the Indian, save the man, right? That was the attitude and the approach. My great-grandfather is a man named Freeman Bean, and Freeman was the first tribal member in Western Oregon to own his own logging company. And he owned his own logging company because he had a mobile butcher business and he made enough money that he could actually afford to buy logging equipment. Because in the early 1900s, people wouldn't give loans to tribal people. And because of racism, a lot of logging operators wouldn't hire tribal people to work in the woods. So in Western Oregon, with the prime economy being the timber industry, tribal people were left out of it. And because my grandfather had the money to buy that logging equipment, he started a logging business and he put Indian people to work in the woods, being able to make a living income. It's said that he made millions 3 times, and depending on who you talk to, either lost it all or gave it away each time. He's quite a spirited character on our reservation. But his great-grandfather is a man named Joseph Shingretta. And Joseph signed the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855. He grew up on a homestead on Champoeg, French Prairie. And well, maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later, but he had a hard life, a real hard life. And he saw all those things that happened on the land and lost his family and was an orphan and moved to the reservation and tried to make the most of it. And our people were forced from this place to go live in this cold pocket valley out in the coast that you probably maybe know as the Spirit Mountain Casino, which is our main economic engine that keeps everything going. But there's a place, it's called Grand Ronde, and there's a real Spirit Mountain. Spirit Mountain isn't just a casino. Spirit Mountain is a sacred Kalapuya mountain that exists in western Yamhill County here. So I'm a person of this place. My family's been here for over 500 generations. And we know that because we have these stories of the floods. And the floods happened between 13 and 18,000 years ago. And those floods, they filled the Willamette Valley with over 400 feet of water. And our stories indicate how people moved out in front of those floodwaters and they sought refuge in certain high points. They talk about how the water rose up really slowly so people could actually run out in front of it. And it matches all of our geological understanding that really didn't become popular in science till around the 1980s. And yet anthropologists were recording these stories of our elders in the late 1800s, early 1900s about these flood events. So it's not as if we're just borrowing memories from the past and pulling them forward. Now, a lot of us don't think in thousands of years of timeline, but 13 to 18,000 years ago is like 7 times Rome. And I'm told all men my age are supposed to think about Rome all the time, right? That's like a thing, right? So 7 times Rome. There were people walking around, and they had memories, and they've picked up traditions, and there's ways of knowing. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those ideas and trends that I think have value throughout time. We also remember other events, like this is Crater Lake. We have a story about how Crater Lake was created, right? There were people, our ancestors, who remembered those things and passed them down generation after generation. I told you who my family was, but it doesn't really tell you what I do. And to tell you what I do, I think of myself as a placekeeper. And this is a term that I think would be really helpful to understand that. Indigenous placekeeping, a form of engagement that prioritizes ecological, historical, and cultural relationships to place while bringing the presence of indigenous histories and futures into focus. The work that I do is human rights work. It's about the persistence of our people. It's about ensuring that these legacies of the past continue into the present. I do that as the Cultural Resources Department Manager for my tribe. I lead a staff of around 25, 30, depending on the season. We operate a museum, we do government regulatory. We saw some of those permitting agencies. When they have to contact the tribe, they're contacting our offices and they're saying, hey, what are these things that could impact, or what are these concerns that exist, like the fish example that we heard from Chris earlier. So I've worked for 20 years for my tribe. I was first a wildland firefighter. I spent a season as a hot shot. I've done a lot of different work to collaborate on the protection of gathering sites, on village sites. We opened a museum. I created a research center for tribal members as well as the greater public to support the growth of indigenous artists and also the recognition of indigenous placed art forms. And so I want to give an example of what placekeeping can look like. And this is a sculpture that's in a canoe that's being delivered to its final place. This sculpture is called The Man from Kashik. It's located at George Rogers Park in Lake Oswego on the waterfront. And we found it was easier to take the sculpture to the river's edge by canoe than it was to carry it from the parking lot. So we delivered it that day. But it's a form in the shape of the regional art form, Columbia River art. It has a carved face with steel, and he's holding 2 eels. He is holding lamprey, this anadromous fish that's a really important traditional food that oftentimes gets overlooked when salmon is thought about. But it's a fish that migrates out to the ocean and has this big sucker on it that attaches to large sea mammals and other creatures. So there's a traditional story that's about a man who teaches the people how to eat eel and go eeling at Willamette Falls. And we wanted to commemorate the story of that because that location is near where the village of Kashik was. And there was a large water project that was essentially going to put a large water pipeline through the middle of one of the oldest village sites in the North Willamette Valley, which sits under old Lake Oswego, old town of Lake Oswego. And so we've heard some of these words of mitigation or other ideas, and this is an instance where they said, well, we're going to study it and we're going to tell you what's there. And we said, well, that's not enough. We want something that shows that indigenous heritage and cultural knowledge exists in this place and it's meaningful. And so they funded this art installation. And it was sort of the beginning of my journey that subsequently now has resulted in me being the vice chair of the Oregon Arts Commission, which is I started to do the work of getting indigenous public art recognized. And that's really odd. We think of native art and people think of totem poles. They think of maybe Southwest art. But we have our own regional art form from this place that's known as Lower Columbia River art or Chinookan art. And it's a big thing that I've been working on as a part of doing placekeeping. There is another story that I wanted to bring in because we were talking about water and we're talking about the holding back of water. And there's a traditional story from the Willamette Valley. Coyote's this creator figure for us. Coyote goes through the landscape and does things and is fallible, is representative of all aspects of humanity. And Coyote comes across, Coyote isn't finding any water. And all of the water is dammed up. The frogs have dammed up the river. And they've essentially made it impossible. Only the frogs can have the water. They're trying to charge people for water, right? And Coyote basically tricks them, and he digs out and he breaks the dam, right? And so this is like a story of place that belongs here. And what I want to share with you that's a really cool project that happened is the city of Corvallis, their watershed where they draw all their city water is on Mary's Peak outside of the town of Corvallis. And they had some unnamed creeks, including the creek that fed their water facility, right? And we renamed all those creeks in Kalapuya names. So they have Onhoots for panther and Oshayam for bear. And we named that creek that uses all the water for the people of Corvallis, Frog Creek, Onquaqua, right? And it was sort of tongue-in-cheek. It was sort of humor, right? But it captures that essence of place and of knowing. Not that I have grand plans that Coyote's going to come and tear down their dam, right? But that's an element of placekeeping, of like keeping this knowledge and practice and giving context of these cultural teachings. And just shows somewhat of an example. There's also and I'm not going to go deep into it about water, but there is something referred to as the winner's doctrine, which is attached to first use, first right with tribes. And when you see that, there really is a lot of Indian policy and law related to water. And oftentimes the treaties themselves are that foundational legal document. So when I mentioned that my ancestors signed the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, it would seem as if that's my treaty. But if you own land or you rely upon commerce or business or land within the Willamette Valley Treaty area of 1855, it's your treaty too, because it is the foundation of land ownership. It's the right of all of those pieces to be able to do what happens in this space. And that comes into play as we start to get to scarcity. You know, we've seen that in the Klamath Basin with the Klamath tribes in Oregon and California. I think that there will be conversations to sort of be had at that macro level. And while people might not know a thing about treaties today, if we get into water disputes in the future, that treaty document is going to become really important for people. That's not really why we were here, but I had to add that in. Myth of wilderness. You know, we take a lot of things. I was a student of wilderness. I'm pretty sure in my high school yearbook I quoted some transcendentalist author like Henry David Thoreau or Emerson, right? Everybody loves that. But as I got older, I had to start to contextualize what a lot of the early environmental movement was about. And it was deeply seated in racism and about exclusionary practices of other people, and about the justification of taking land from indigenous people who had that land. It's a part of the reality of what we have. And I don't mean that to, pressure guilt or do these other aspects, but The idea that the land was wilderness and ready to be claimed and divided, and settlers had a right to that land because it wasn't being utilized, overlooked all the utilization that actually existed. And the abundance of the Willamette Valley that early settlers loved so much, of why it was the #1 priority area for settlement by Americans in the West over California, right? It was because it was so productive. And it was productive because of 500 generations of cultural practices managing the landscape. And I have 3 pictures here that are huge tools that our ancestors used to produce abundance on the landscape. I'm going to give you some case studies as we go along, but the pictures you're looking at are pruning or coppicing plants all the way back to the ground to force growth. These are bulbs that would be dug up and divided and replanted in order to foster growth. And then fire. Fire is the most powerful tool that humans and humanity across the entire globe has had to alter and influence their physical environments. And today, without many people having an open relationship with how fire can produce abundance, we only think of it for the catastrophic and the loss that it can produce. But I'm going to give you some examples about what that can look like. There's an event that happens in the Willamette Valley 3,000 years ago, and there's a period called the Holocene in climate. And it's warmer and drier in this place. And around 3,000 years ago, although the change is much less rapid than the changes we're experiencing now, it became cooler and wetter. And there's an amazing study that looked at fire interval returns, so charcoal lenses in all the lake beds that existed for over 14,000 years in the Willamette Valley. And what they found is the inverse of what you would expect. When it becomes cooler and wetter, you would think that the interval between fires would increase and the intensity would increase because more fuel accumulates, and then when it burns, it produces larger and a different type of ash. But the opposite happened, and the opposite meant that fires actually increased in frequency and the intensity decreased. And the explanation for that is humans applying fire to the landscape, in many cases to preserve the oak habitats that would have been challenged and not be able to exist in the same conditions without fire. But there was a knock-on added benefit, and the benefit was that fire in many cases stimulates plant growth. There's another recent study that was just completed 3 years ago out of Berkeley that studied hazel in Northern California. And all of the hazel patches that they burned, the study was for 10 years. They looked at available forage for deer and elk when a hazel stand was burned. And they found that from years 0 to 3, there was over 1,000% available forage for deer and elk. Up to year 5, they still had over 500%, and at the termination of the study of 10 years later, those patches were still producing 300% more available forage for deer and elk. Now, if you think about that on a landscape level capacity, and you think about the carrying capacity of just caloric input for animal species, deer and elk and other things by burning, because you're actually stimulating that plant to grow faster, to grow more, it's huge outcomes that can sort of be produced by fire. So that's what happened in the Willamette Valley. The population exploded around 3,000 years ago, and we see it in the archaeological record. There's far more people, right? Those people are establishing new village sites where there hadn't ever been village sites before. There's this massive expansion that essentially occurs. And so to me, when we think in climate, it's this idea that things change and that we as human people have this ability to observe and adapt. Like, I was really drawn to this concept like that was mentioned, I think, by Greg earlier, which is agriculture is the problem and the solution, right? I think that we get at that, and it's like, yeah, right? And one of the ways that I really like to put that is we have new inputs and we have new desired outcomes. And so when we really start to boil these things down about the value that we're seeing on the landscape, one of the greatest things that we can do is we can start to look at, when I have conservationists or restorationists say that they value the landscape that was my ancestors, I have a lot of questions. And my questions are, well, what about it? Right? And sometimes what I find is there's sort of this fantasized version of what they think it is, because they think that humans can only be destructive. They don't think that humans can actually be generative and helpful within ecosystems and functions. But the societal values that my ancestors possessed essentially resulted in humans taking actions that produced abundance. And some of the main ways and tools that they did that was this list that I'm putting up before you. Burning, which I described, pruning or coppicing. So, if you do it every 3 years, you can cut some plants all the way back to the ground, and it sends up straight shoots and whips that are really productive. The idea of ownership. There's certain plants like tarweed, which is a relative of the sunflower, and Indian tobacco from this place, where people actually own those patches. They own the plants. There's soil tillage that our ancestors did. There's fertilization and actual intentionality of moving like fish resources from the river or eels into private plots. We have selective harvest, right? I'll get into this with a camas example where we're actually dividing bulbs and moving things, keeping bulbs high up in the ground so that they don't have to compete or use energy to drive up through the ground. Transplanting. There's all these examples of diversity around old village sites being massively abundant because people were actually bringing in their medicines and their other food plants close, as well as seeding. So, where am I at? Slide 10. Ooh, you saw Frogger? Yeah, good times. Hold on your hat. We're going to talk about spies first, and then we'll get to some Frogger. So this is the Willamette Valley in 1847. I've been trying to place this for some time. I think it's actually proximate to Newberg. I think that there's a chance that we're actually looking off of the corner of, we're looking down Chehalem Creek towards where Newberg would be, and we're actually on like a corner of the Dundee Hills. But I'd be really interested for anybody's feedback about it. A couple things to draw your attention to. In today's world, the area by the river and the creek is where the trees are. There's no trees right up against the river and the creek. They're actually out in these pockets, and those big openings are being maintained by fire. And you can even see fire in the distance. There's a large cumulus cloud, and in that ridge, it's pushing from left to right. There's actually a fire that's burning on that ridgeline, which would be somewhere along Chehalem, if I'm placing this correctly, would be somewhere along Chehalem Ridge. And that's partially tracked because I've gone back to the journal of Paul Kane and seen where his route was and how he journeyed from essentially today's Gaston kind of down and through to Newberg before heading south. I like to show this slide to people because a lot of people just don't have a framework for what our landscape looked like before it was all rectangles. Right? Because we've made rectangles and straight lines out of all of these things, and it's so dynamic that it's changed, and yet we have this beauty of looking back through time of, nearly 200 years of what the landscape looked like in the valley. So one of the case studies I want to give you is about camas. And camas is a main food source for our ancestors. It is this purple flower that fills the Willamette Valley every spring. You'll still see huge pockets of it along the I-5 corridor between here and Eugene, but a lot of parks and other places are that way. And you can eat the bulbs. Now you have to cook them for about 3 days. They have a sugar that has to convert over into an edible sugar. Otherwise, you get a really upset stomach, like Lewis and Clark, who writes in their journals that they passed a lot of gas and that they thought the Indians were trying to kill them. But that's camas. And so camas can be preserved for these really long periods of time. Once you process it correctly, you can actually store it in a dry environment for up to 3 years. And we don't think about that function too, where ancestral people had these food systems and lifeways that weren't hand to mouth. They were actually influencing, impacting for generational outcomes. Human-camas relationship over generations. There's this perspective that everything is in relationship with itself, and that relationships aren't just between people. There's relations between people and the animal world, the plant world, even rocks, right? And when you start to give more agency to individual forces in the world, it results in looking at things and making choices in a different way. And so a part of what I like to share about this idea is that if a camas patch is becoming more abundant over time, then people's social obligations of being a tribal person are fulfilled. And if it's diminishing over time, it's sort of reflecting that they're not living life in a good way. Because these patches are maintained by families over generations and generations. And a part of that is when you employ good harvesting practice, the patch itself becomes more and more abundant. And I'll give you an example of that. And this is why our action of gathering produces abundance. And this is one plant, but it happens for many things. So camas reproduces by bulblets. Think like garlic, right? It'll produce all these small pieces, and it also has seed. So I have a picture of seed here. But it takes about 3 years for seed from camas to become a bulb that's producing a flower. So you have a delay from your seed. But just like any bulb, if you don't dig up the bulb and keep it close to the surface, it's going to get deeper and deeper. It wants to dig into the ground, and then it has to use more and more energy to push up. But the other aspect of this is that those bulbs will actually start to crowd each other out. And so our ancestors would dig up the bulbs, they'd take the big ones, and they'd leave the little ones, putting them back in the ground. So if each clump of camas that you gather, you take the big ones and you leave 5 little bulbs and put them back in the ground, those bulbs aren't all competing with each other next year. They have room to move, the soil's loosened because it's been dug up, and it's still producing seed. And so this idea that if somebody has been gathering in that spot for generations and generations, and you go back and you keep doing the practice that's existed, there's going to be more camas each year. And this was completely lost on early settlers, right? Early settlers came into the valley, sometimes people starving on their own wagons, not knowing that their wagons were like rolling over food that they could have eaten to keep themselves alive. But their hogs and their livestock knew what good food was. And those hogs and livestock got fat on all of the acorns that were being, groomed and developed in these acorn forests of our ancestors, of the camas and the other tubers and roots. And unlike people, or even a lot of native plants, a lot of these introduced livestock were indiscriminate in essentially just going through the whole patch. A lot of us have heard stories about, how sheep or a cow will actually dig up the plant and the roots, whereas deer or elk will go through and clip, right? These are different comparisons of what's happening. And so over time, while the settlers' journals talk about how the hogs are fatter, they've never seen hogs get so fat in such a small period of time, it's because it's hundreds of years of a certain way of interacting with that landscape to create abundance that's being realized in these really short periods of times of settlers. And meanwhile, the settlers are still stuck in this idea of, because Indian people don't use the land the land the way that we use the land, we just call it wilderness. And they're not attributing the abundance of the land that they're benefiting from to tribal actions over time. Which gets me to, isn't it just all about timing? Right? Like how much of all the work, all the things that we've talked about today, from vineyards to other pieces of it, it's like that's a thing. And when we think about tribal people having in order to influence those systems, observation is the key goal, where you're actually like paying attention, listening, taking good records. Our records are oral histories. Right? The whole winter time was basically spent sitting in our longhouses, telling stories, right? Weaving baskets, like connecting intergenerational knowledge. But I jokingly put up Frogger, which if you don't know is like an 70s, 80s game where you use a little frog and you try to like navigate through obstacles that come through. But it just reminds me of that. Another really great example of managing for abundance of our ancestors is the practice of first fish. This is a mural that I would strongly recommend trying to go see in person. This doesn't do it justice. It's a mural by Sherrod Yonker in Toma Villa that's in the City of Portland building downtown. It's in a public area. It's on the second floor. You can go in the front doors, go up and see it. But it is a really cool mural of salmon. First fish is a practice where our ancestors are in relationship with salmon. And the world is set in order so that if we respect salmon, they'll continue to be here. Salmon and deer, when Coyote, in the creation of the world, before people come, Coyote goes and talks to everyone and essentially says, people are coming. I need you to prepare a gift of how you're going to provide for people when they arrive. And the first two to volunteer themselves are deer and salmon, and they both volunteer themselves, their actual physical flesh, to feed the people. And so in that, there becomes an obligation that people have to take care of and provide for deer and salmon because they make the ultimate sacrifice. And one of those ways that the Clackamas people, indigenous people to essentially the lower Willamette River, the east side of Portland, it's convenient that a county is centered on their homelands and named that, and a river, the Clackamas people. So that's the geography we're talking about. There's a practice called first fish, and so we still do this today. We carve wooden herons, we put them out by the river before the spring fish run, and they're there as watchers to watch for the first fish to come up the river. And when the first fish is caught by tribal members, we take that fish in ceremony and we honor it and we cook it and we share it together and we engage in ceremony, and no one can fish for 5 days. And then when we finish that ceremony, we return the skin, the bones, all the other parts of that fish back to the river, because that's a way that you culturally respect salmon. We have songs that we sing. We have all these different customs, because if we don't honor and look after the salmon, then we know they won't return. That's really interesting. It's a cultural practice. It's interesting. There's also science behind it. And I think looking at the scientific side is really fascinating. If you're a fisherman, you know that first push up the river, after 5 days, all those fish that were pushing up the river are probably already upriver. And it means that your first fish that's in the river, you're favoring earlier and earlier returns of those fish. And so by proxy, what it's doing is ensuring that there's fish that get up to spawn in the habitat, or there's fish that get up to your neighbors so that they have salmon, so that in wintertime, when everyone's living off their stores, your neighbor isn't hungry and they're not coming knocking on your door looking for food, maybe a little more violently than just looking. And so it fulfills these different functions. We also think about returning the bones to the river, right? When we think about nutrients and what that means and the concentration of the types of nutrients that are coming out of the ocean and moving into these inland areas that get used in different ways. Flesh is one thing, but the physical bones and the calcium and these other things that are there, they connect something in that ecosystem and make it important. It also continues to show in these creeks or other places the indicators. As that's decaying in the river, there's still something that's decaying that's indicating to species when they're trying to return and come upriver that is a river that fish are still in. So this is this idea of first fish. I said I'd talk about spies. So this is my spy. Captain Henry Warr, 1845, he's a British guy. You have to realize at this time, Oregon isn't in existence, and it's a big question of Oregon territory, whether it's going to be British or whether it's going to be American. Even the Russians and the Spanish at this point are kind of thrown in as like their potential contenders. So the British send out, and a lot of these earliest accounts that we have of interactions and engagements with tribal people are actually these different exploring expeditions. The most famous would be Lewis and Clark But there's others that come. There's Wilkes, the Wilkes expedition, and we have drawings and we have sketches of the physical landscape and peoples. And this is another image of the Willamette Valley that shows these open prairies. And after I've shared some of the things about fire use, about acorn management, actually I didn't mention that, but I'll show you here. These trees that you're seeing out in the distance, it's like an oak savanna, and I know many of you are caring for oak trees, you're treating it in that way. And one of the ways that our ancestors, and even today, we're actively looking to manage oak stands is before harvest, about 2 to 3 weeks beforehand, we burn around the oak tree that we're gonna gather from. Think from like the drip line all the way to the trunk. And what that does is we know that the acorns that fall off first are oftentimes the ones that are bug infected, right? They have weevils or they have other things in it, and so they're less likely to be compromised. And it also means when you go out to gather your acorns, you know those acorns that have dropped in the last 2 to 3 weeks, so they're fresh. Plus you don't have all the grass to dig around. Well, if you do that, it's convenient for your gathering, but it's also convenient when catastrophic fire comes through, because now there's no ladder fuels that can burn up into the canopy. There's less vegetation around the base of those oak trees, so you're less likely to lose these like generational assets of multi-hundred-year-old really productive oak trees, because you're actually, each season that you can gather around them, you're burning. The other thing about oak trees that was also, and resources in general, is this idea of distribution and patterns that we miss. And so I want to bring it up because a lot of us don't know much about oak ecology. And oak trees do something called masting. And this is an example, people who are orchardists or others, right? There's like good apple years, there's not good apple years. Well, how acorns work is typically it's on a 5 to 7 year cycle. And it will build where you have a low acorn production year, and then it'll get bigger and bigger each year until like a huge mast year, and where it produces massive amounts of acorns, and then it won't produce as many acorns. It'll produce small after that, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so you have these 5 to 7 year ebbs and flows of cycles of individual stands of oak trees. So a whole stand might mass together, but it doesn't mean that all of the oaks in a general area, which means you either have a general idea about systems and patterns over these long horizons in time, but you're also sending your people out from your village to check different oak groves. And you're seeing like, oh, what oak grove is like really productive this year? And you go to the productive oak groves and you burn, right, ahead of the time that you want to harvest. Well, that became a real problem when you're thinking about land ownership, because if people are thinking of fenced properties in my land, but people aren't returning even every year to their spot because it's not the time to do what you do there, a settler could have established their homestead, and then 3 to 5 years later, somebody shows up and they're like, hey, I need to gather my oaks. And they're like, what do you mean your oaks? I've been here 3 years. Like, you haven't been around here at all. And it's just a different concept of time and place and space that did create conflict, but there's also accounts of people saying, well, what are you doing? Show me what you're doing. And relationships that merge back and forth. Something that Greg and I get to talk about and share is there's a lot of accounts of a lot of early settler and positive tribal relationships and settlers in the Umpqua Valley. There's also very negative examples, but it's not simple. It's complex. So I've talked about some of these landscapes. And I want to share this picture of the Dundee Hills. And it's this idea of a different way of the landscape. And we're seeing some of those geometric lines that I talked about, but we're still seeing, watersheds, organic shapes on the outside. And I've shared some of these different ways of understanding or thinking about landscapes, but this is a landscape that sustains economic pursuits, ways of life. There's clear intention about plant and animal relatives that are on the margins of that space, and it supports it. And so with the same idea that I said earlier, like we have new inputs and we have new desired outcomes. And I think that what's interesting as we think about the landscapes that we have is reflecting, like, how are we doing, right? How are we doing with, does a landscape like this reflect our values? Do we need to do more work on our societal values, or do we need to do more work on our landscape reflecting the values that we hold? Or, do we need to work on both? Or is it just good how it is? I think that those are topics of conversation, and clearly topics that Live and the work that you're all doing like embrace and think about, because you're seeking to do something that's a little bit different or engaged. But that's the same thing that people have been doing forever in this land. And that we've taken this idea and break from the past to say, oh, Indigenous people and the way that they did it is so different from the way that I do it that I can't imagine how I would draw a through line or connect that. And I think that there's just ways of abundance and thinking about that. People don't imagine that our ancestors crawled up in oak trees and tip-pruned oak trees so that they'd produce more fruiting elements to produce more acorns at later points. These are things that are recorded well on the record. For me, so I guess, so that working question is, how are each of you keeping place? What are the places you are keeping? How are you keeping those places? How is your keeping of a place changing over time? And then for me, these are some pictures of what I'm doing. I talked about my work on behalf of the tribe and the work that we're doing around art and around preservation of traditional foods and lifeways and homes. But more recently, I've kind of dipped my toe in the water of wine. I've kind of asked myself this question of, I live in Dundee, I live really close to here, and that working question was, this whole region where my ancestors are from is becoming known for wine. So who from the tribe is going to learn enough about this wine stuff to try to make context over how it fits in to tribal understandings of place? And so I've started that, and it's a curiosity. I just feel this obligation as an Indigenous person to like provide that context and understanding. And so to that extent, keep a lookout for a boutique wine project of mine in the future. That's a curiosity. I'm definitely up to talk about it any time. But I'm also growing a tea garden of Camilla sinensis. And I talked briefly about that earlier in the tea. But these ideas that we have flavors that were maybe known to my ancestors, or if they weren't known, maybe they're good enough right now that they should be known to my descendants or all of you. And I think that there's this living idea of being a conduit through time and place, of trying to take practices that create abundance and bring those forward or integrate them into the way of what we do. But really, at the end of the day, I'm raising a family. And the goal is to continue traditions of my ancestors, and then also, ensure that the things that we're creating together, like, keep going into the future. Like, I think a lot of you, taking the best of what we have and moving it forward, and where we have to adapt and pivot, change. So the working question that I have to all of you, if you get the opportunity to talk with each other, is embrace this idea of being a placekeeper. Each of you care about the places that you tend and manage and are thoughtful, but this is a vessel place, and the places you care for that hold everything that's ever happened there. And sometimes we only get a little bit of a view of what that is, but it's so much more of a rich experience, and I feel generative when we tell those stories, when we hear it, and then sometimes when we create those stories. Because all of you are creating your own special impacts, understandings, knowings, and story time is a great idea, Luis. I think that the story times would be really great. So I do have some resources. If you're interested about traditional knowledge within the Northwest, these are some wonderful resources. You can email me at david.harrelson@grandround.org. I'm happy to share with what I have. We also have that research center in Grand Round if you're based in Oregon. We're open Tuesday through Fridays, and we take appointments, and we have a full-time research librarian that can help support understanding a little bit more about your land or where you're at. We're at Chehalem Cultural Center. When you're in Kalapuya people homelands, CH means the place of something. So Chehalem means the outside place, right? And it's actually in reference to the inside place because the core of the Tualatin Kalapuya world was around Gaston and up Patton Valley because it's where all their winter villages are and where they used to gather Wapato. But this was the outside place where people hunted and gathered, with the exception that there was also a village of this name in between Newberg and Dundee. And that village is where the head treaty signer for the Tualatin Kalapuya people was actually from. Chief Keakuts was his name. Champui is the place to dig Yampa root. Chichalu, where our museum is the place of the burnt timber. These are things that still are written on our landscape, and that's just another example of the vessel, right? There's knowledge contained in all these naming conventions that people don't even know. Our rivers, our counties, it's all based in these traditional teachings. But the other thing that you're going to find in these books is different plant relationships, both Gifted Earth and the book Keeping It Living and Pacific Northwest Foraging. Just talk about how, instead of just foraging free food, how you can actually be in relationship with those plants to ensure that they continue their abundance while you're still in a relationship with them. So thank you for the opportunity to share and talk with you all. I know it's very different than the scientific world of it. It's a little bit of history, it's a little bit of cultural teachings, but it is really special to be able to be here on behalf of Indigenous people of this place and just read some of our knowings into the room. So thank you.